About a year ago, I released a video on some ghost towns in northeast Oklahoma, and I had planned to go further that day, but I got so, as I often say, distracted in a good way, that I only made it to about the almost ghost town of White Oak on Route 66. And this is picking up where that trip left off. And so we are just a little bit south in the town of Big Cabin, and this is a few miles off of Route 66, but this is where I stayed last night. So, some interesting things to see, like this church here, this Methodist church that was built in 1952. Big Cabin has an interesting history. Oklahoma wasn't a state until the early 1900s, but there was actually a post office here in 1872, and this was considered Indian territory, and it wasn't named Big Cabin until 1892. It was named after, you guessed it, a big cabin that was here. So it was not too hard to figure out, what to name the town, because that was like the main thing that was here. And it's been a small town. It's been a couple hundred people. It's down to 174 in the 2020 census. And so nice little place to start our day. The goal of my videos a lot of times is to go a little bit further off the beaten path. Route 66 is off the beaten path for a lot of people, but it's a famous place. There's been tons of videos. I've made tons of videos on it, and we're certainly going to see some classic Route 66 stuff today. But I'm also going to try to show you some stuff near Route 66 that maybe you haven't seen or haven't heard of. And if you're ever this way or in this area, you might want to check them out. But yeah, we'll definitely go through a few bigger towns. We'll skip right through those quickly to get to the smaller towns, the ghost towns, and some quirky areas. Like this town of Big Cabin is near an interstate, and if you've ever driven by it, there's a big Indian right there. So that's kind of a Route 66 quirky thing that's not on Route 66. So we'll try to find some interesting stuff like that. And so yeah, let's get our day started. As we head up north towards Route 66, there's an abandoned school, I'm assuming right here north of Big Cabin. I couldn't find much information except in the early 90s they were struggling with their school district, and so I'm not sure if this is from that era or not. And this is now where we are getting ready to turn left onto Route 66, and we will pretty quickly exit Route 66 there at White Oak and head to our next town of Bowlin Springs. Our first ghost town of the day is Bowlin Spring or Bowlin Springs. On the map it says Bowlin Spring, but then when I get here it says Bowlin Springs. Not bowling, Bowlin. This was a Cherokee settlement. In 1879 is when it got settled, and it's hard to find much information about the history of the town or how big it was. Obviously, it had some sort of probably growth at that time in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and I found an article where they had recently built a community building for the history of this area, this town. And so that was pretty neat to see. That's like the main, modern thing when you explore around this area. In the downtown area, they have an old grocery store and barbecue place that, it says 1879. I don't know if that building is that old or if that's how long the business has been going, but 1879 is in a couple different places right here, and that's kind of cool to see that the people here are hanging on to telling some of that history. And then that new community building means that that they're trying to keep it alive, and that's awesome. And it's down some dirt roads. It's not easy to get to, but definitely if you want to see some cool older things and basically what in a ghost town, then Bowlin Springs would be a great place to visit. We're in New Alluwe, and it's called New Alluwe because there used to be an old Alluwe. This is kind of an interesting ghost town story. Originally, near this area, a mile or so west of here, there was a town called Alluwe, and it was originally called Lightning Creek. It was a settlement by the Eastern Delaware tribe who had a treaty with the Cherokee and created this settlement here, named it Lightning Creek. And it had a post office in 1872. And then some other people kind of settled in here, and they ended up naming it Alluwe. And Alluwe means, it's a native word, translation means superior. Oil was discovered here in the early 1900s and became a boom town. And actually, not far from here, about 10 miles from here, was the first discovery of oil in the state of Oklahoma. So this was a very significant, place in historical terms in the discovery of oil. And so it was a boom town. Over 1,000 people moved here, and it was certainly Alluwe became a bustling community. Then the oil boom subsided, and people obviously moved away. That's what happens. Pretty normal story. And then in the 1950s, the U.S. Corps of Engineers decided to build a nearby dam and a lake, and it was right where the town of Alluwe was sitting. So the town moved here about a mile east and became New Alluwe. So any remnants of the old Alluwe are under the nearby lake. It's a pretty interesting place to visit. There are some things to see here. There are some, it's a nice road, so it's easy to get here from Route 66, a few miles. And there are some, churches, there's some old buildings, maybe a business or two. And then we're in a nice park. And right behind me, that little white structure, I believe is a tornado shelter. And so it's kind of an interesting, way to put a little shelter together here in the park. Lots of old playground equipment, which we always like. So yeah, well worth the visit. Our first significant town on today's trip in terms of population is Chelsea, Oklahoma, as the population is around 2,000. And this was started in the early 1880s as a stop on the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad, and then it was incorporated as a town in the Cherokee Nation and in the late 1880s. And remember, Oklahoma did not become a state until the early 1900s. Oil was discovered here, not too far from here, actually, and we'll see that shortly. There's some historic places like the Chelsea Motel, and that's a Route 66 landmark for sure. And then this is the Pryor Creek Bridge, built in 1926, right at the same time as Route 66 was built and brought a lot of traffic through Chelsea. Down this pretty lonely back road is where Oklahoma's first oil well is. In 1882, a guy named Edward Bird, who was married to a Cherokee woman, discovered some oil seeps in this area, didn't really act on it until 1887 when he and some other investors created the United States Oil and Gas Company, and they leased the drilling rights from the Cherokee Nation. And then not much longer after that, they started this oil well. And it became, it was just kind of the beginning of a much larger area called the Chelsea and Alluwe oil field, and really had significant impact on the area and entire state as a whole. The next community is called Bushy Head, and I don't know much information about it. This is, I think, maybe an old building that was burned to the ground, but it was named after one of the principal chiefs of the Cherokee, had a post office from the late 1800s to in the 1950s. And I was driving around, I really couldn't find much of anything. I think that might be a railroad depot of some sort, and then I just drove up to where the railroad is, and this is about all I could find. And once again, that's a different shot of what maybe has something to do with the railroad. So if anybody knows anything about Bushy Head and the history, please put it in the comments. I'd like to know more. Our next stop is Ed Galloway's Totem Pole Park, and it's a very famous stop along Route 66. Ed Galloway retired in 1937, moved to this property, and started building the Totem Pole Park until he passed away in 1961. And now it's on the National Register of Historic Places and is taken care of by the local historical society. It's an incredible place. It's definitely a must-see if you are in this area of Oklahoma. Just down the road from the Totem Pole Park is the small town of Foyle, Oklahoma, and it's actually bigger now than it was back in the day, so that's interesting how it's kind of gotten bigger compared to some of these other places, these really small towns that get smaller. It was started in around 1890 with the post office, had the railroad come through a little bit earlier. There's some Route 66 iconic places like this gas station, and there's a old church. Interesting story about a citizen named Andy Payne. There was a transcontinental foot race that was over 3,000 miles in length that a young, just out of high school, local from Foyle, Oklahoma won, and they have erected a statue in his honor. We're at the south end of town, and this is the Andy Payne Park, and that's Route 66 right over there where that truck is going. And right here, this was the original Route 66. And it went up through downtown Foyle. So it's about 3/4 of a mile long. We'll finish out our little tour of Foyle by driving up through the original Route 66. Just south of Foyle is the Route 66 landmark of Kong's Corner. I don't know how old this place is, but it's always a good photo op. And then just east is the Little Rock Church. This church was built around 1940 and is adjacent to the Washington Cemetery, which is one of the oldest Indian cemeteries that is maintained by the state of Oklahoma. Our next community is Sequoia, and there's not much here. It's an unincorporated community. They do have a nice high school. You see the football field there. Had a post office for about 40 years in the late 1800s, and all that I've seen that's very, historical looking are some of these old churches here. By the way, Sequoia is named after the inventor of the Cherokee alphabet. Claremore is one of the larger places on this stretch of Route 66, so we're just going to breeze through it and head on our way to the smaller, quirkier places. But to give a little info about Claremore, it's about 20,000 people. It has continued to grow over the years, which is a terrific sign. It was originally an Osage village in the early 1800s. It was destroyed by the Cherokee later on, and the railroad came through in 1870s, and then it became the town of Claremore in the 1880s officially. And so there's a lot to see here. The Will Rogers Museum is here. He's from this area, so lots to see in Claremore. If you're into old bridges, just near Catoosa is a bunch of bridges you can check out. And you can drive through this one. This one's on kind of heading north. And just past that, you have the Rogers Point Park that has several other bridges to check out. And all in this area, there are railroad bridges. There's old bridges that used to be on Route 66, ones that are currently there, ones that are kind of over across the way. And so here's some drone footage that you can see all the different bridges in this area. Our next stop is the very famous Route 66 attraction, the Blue Whale of Catoosa, just outside the town of Catoosa. And this is one very well known. If you are on Route 66, it's a must stop to get the pictures with the whale and even to walk through the whale. So definitely a fun and unique experience to do something like that. There are other things in this area that were originally built, but the main thing now here is to see the whale. Just in the same property, they have an old boat right here that has seen better days, but the blue whale is definitely something you got to stop and see. Across the street is the Arrowhead Trading Post. This is a landmark built in the early 1930s. But up in the town, you know, it's kind of a regular town with some history as well. It was started in the 1880s. It was a cow town, and it was very small, and it has grown significantly. The population has kind of exploded. There's been some industry brought to the area, so that's nice to see. And it has some cool things to see here in the town as well. If you notice, Route 66 goes just south of the interstate as we head into Tulsa. And one of the interesting places I found was this Buddhist temple, just kind of right along the road, and somewhere you can pull in and walk around. And it's got dozens and dozens of these statues that I've seen a lot of these in other places. Like I've been to Thailand and Cambodia, and a lot of them are the same ones, just maybe smaller. But it's really interesting. It's a really beautiful place to get out and stretch your legs. It's open to the public, so definitely recommended to stop by the Buddhist temple and explore around a little bit.
We've made it to the end of our Route 66 and kind of off Route 66 trip today. I am under the highway, and it's obviously a Route 66 themed little walkway that ends right back there. And so it was a kind of interesting trip today. You know, started out a lot of rural areas and some pretty cool places I hadn't been to before, and then went to some pretty, you know, kind of standard Route 66 places like the Blue Whale of Catoosa, and then as we get to the end, we get to the city of Tulsa, which is always my least favorite part, is the busy city. And there's so much more to see in a place like Tulsa, but I prefer to kind of go to the small places. But it's been a fun trip. Hopefully you have enjoyed riding along Route 66 and vicinity here in Oklahoma.
Thanks for watching this video about Route 66 through Oklahoma. If you like this video, there are several ways to support the channel. You can donate by hitting the thanks button under the video or purchase Travel with a Wiseguy merchandise. In the description of this video is a link to my website where you can learn more about the channel and sign up for my newsletter. And if you aren't interested in any of that, I'm just happy you took a few minutes out of your day to watch this video and learn about Route 66. Thank you very much, and now on to the outtakes.